Well, good morning, Heartland. It's great to be with you. Hey, before we begin, I just wanted to say thank you. Many of you have been giving towards our COVID response fund, and I want you to know that over these past couple of weeks, we've actually had the opportunity to help several families. And so I just wanted to say thank you for your generosity. And actually, we're actually working on another way also of helping people in our community, and we're not quite ready to tell you just yet, but stay tuned in the next week or two, and we're just really excited about some of the new ideas that are kind of bubbling up to the surface and new ways in which we can share the gospel in a very tangible way. Well, today we're continuing our series called Victory in the Battles That Matter, and certainly there's a raging debate on what battles matter more than other battles, but I believe with all my heart that the battles that are really worth fighting right now, that the battles that really matter right now are the battles that are happening in our hearts, souls, and minds. And last week we talked about, the battle of stress and how Jesus is in the boat with you. And today we're going to be talking about worry. Are you worried today? Do you feel overcome by worry? Worry maybe at the bills that you have to pay. Worry when you look at your pantry or your fridge. Worry when you look at your kids. Are you worried today? And if you were with us last week, maybe you're thinking, well, isn't worry the same as stress? Well, to a degree it is. But worry and stress are distinct enough that they require different solutions, because stress oftentimes is rooted in reality, meaning something stressful happened. For example, that you forgot that you have to write an exam in a couple of weeks, or you have a major paper due. Stress usually happens when there's an unexpected storm in life, maybe the loss of a loved one or the loss of a job. And more often than not, you have to sail through that storm. And so that stress is real and you have to walk through it. But worry oftentimes is being concerned about the storm before the storm ever comes. In fact, sometimes it's being worried about a storm that may never come, but you're just scared that it might come. And a great analogy for worry is a lot like fog. I think this is San Francisco, and that is a lot of fog. But in a lot of ways, worry is like fog because it doesn't take very much water to create an unbelievable amount of fog. In fact, I was researching this, but for fog that covers about 7 square blocks, and that's about 100 feet deep, okay, more than this, of course, it takes about a glass of water to create that much fog. And because of that fog, it's hard to drive, it's hard to maneuver. In fact, driving in fog is one of the most dangerous things you can do. I remember oftentimes when we lived near Lake Huron, and the water or the air from the lake would hit the air from the land, it would create so much fog. And so whenever we would drive in the evening, even though the speed limit was 80 kilometers an hour, we would often drive 50 or 60 simply because the fog was so thick. We thought if there's a deer or an animal or another car, I won't be able to react fast enough because I won't see it quickly enough. But that's what fog does. It impairs your vision. It slows things down. And worry, in a lot of ways, is like fog because it multiplies our concerns. It magnifies our worries. It keeps us from effectively maneuvering on the roads of life. It makes it hard to deal with cares and concerns. It makes normal challenges out to be insurmountable obstacles. And the thing about fog is, if you probably have been in fog, I've been in some pretty, thick fog over the course of my life. But the thing about fog is that you can still breathe in fog. It's actually kind of cool. If it's thick enough, you can almost feel the water vapor, but it's almost refreshing even, But when it comes to the fog of worry, in a lot of ways, worry chokes the life out of you. It's hard to breathe. In a way, it takes your breath away because it just makes these problems seem like they're just so big and so insurmountable. And because that's what worry does. And if you're not careful, worry can take the place of the obstacles you were trying to avoid in the first place. The worry can become so intense that the thing you were worried about never actually ends up happening, but the worry itself creates unbelievable challenges in your life. And this might be hard to answer depending on your level of your ability to introspect and really your honesty and humility. But has your worry ever become more problematic than the thing that you were worried about? Has your worry become problematic even though the thing you were worried about never even materialize. So for example, maybe you're worried about provision right now. You're looking at the economy, you're looking at your paycheck. Maybe it's been reduced, maybe there isn't one there. But you're so worried about this that it is preventing you from taking tangible, wise steps forward. For example, maybe you're so worried you just can't get yourself to sit down at a computer and work on your resume or work on your portfolio. Maybe you're just so worried that worry is crippling you to the point where you're no longer applying for jobs or things of that nature. Maybe you're just worried about how to raise your kids in this crazy world. My wife and I, we don't often talk about it, but maybe lately we talk about it more often. But how do you raise kids to be godly, young men and women, and really in a world where it's just so easy not to be a godly young man and godly young woman? And so we talk about it. I think, I'll be honest, I think sometimes we even worry about it, but you have to be careful, because you can worry about something like that so much that you can actually choke the life out of your children, and it's no longer enjoyable being a child in that parent's home, because oftentimes the thing you're worried about, the worry itself, can become the greater obstacle, the greater impediment, the greater problem than the thing that you were worried about. If you're not careful, the worry can actually choke the life out of you. But I believe with my whole heart, as we talk today about worry, that God has a better life for you. God has a life not filled with worry, but filled with courage and hope and his incredible peace. I believe with all my heart that God has a blessed life for you. He wants you to experience incredible blessing, not the blessing of stuff necessarily, but the blessing of his hope, the blessing of his peace and his joy. And in the passage that we're about to read, we're going to be reading in Matthew chapter 6. But Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7 is a part of the Bible that we call the Sermon on the Mount. And in this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talked about, what the blessed life really is, what the good life really is, and that if you live this kind of life, that you actually have no need to worry, because your God, who knows all that you need, has the ability and the power to provide for you. And so in this passage, as we talk about worry, as we read this first word, therefore, that word therefore is there because these thoughts and these statements about worry are meant to be understood in light of this entire teaching of Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. But in the middle of all that, he said in chapter 6, therefore I tell you, do not worry. Great advice, isn't it? Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Now, again, in this passage, chapters 5, 6, and 7, Jesus talked about, he taught about marriage and about divorce. He taught about finances, about getting revenge. And so he talked about all these things, saying, look, if you honor me, if you live a life that reflects my goodness and mercy and hope, you don't need to worry. In fact, he said this, look at the birds of the air. Look up. Stop looking around and getting caught up in the worries of this world. Like the birds of the air, have a heavenly perspective. Look up. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Now, I don't think Jesus' listeners would have understood worry from a medical perspective. I think we know today of the negative effects of worry. It can cause irritability, it can cause anger, it can cause extreme fatigue, even shortness of breath. In a lot of ways, extreme worry can take your breath away. It can cause depression and things of that nature. Worry does not add to your life. It literally subtracts hours from your life. And I don't know if they would have read it that way, but we know that to be true today. Who of you can add a single hour to your life by worrying? And why do you worry about clothes? See the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Now, this next verse we're going to read, and I would be interested to know if you really agree with it. And we'll talk a little bit more about it later. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. We read passages like this, and sometimes I wonder if we really read them. There's another example of what I'm saying in another part of the Bible. Jesus was asked, well, how are we supposed to pray? And Jesus replied, pray like this: Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And then he says this in the prayer: give us this day our daily bread. And I thought to myself, and others have thought the same, would I really be happy with God if he just gave me daily bread? If there was no leftover bread for your pension or for a trip or for a vehicle, would I really be okay with that? But, we read these things and sometimes we don't dig a little deeper. And this passage is actually an example of that. I tell you that Solomon in all his splendor was, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. And we'll come back to that. We'll come back to it. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So don't worry. Great advice. Do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear? Stop repeating these things. In fact, be careful of how much attention or voice you give to your worries. Our faith is not escapism. You have to interact with and deal with life as it is, but you have to be careful that you do not use up your limited emotional capacity, and it is limited, by the way. You have to be careful not to use up your limited breath on words that just create worry. And there are some of us, maybe you're watching right now, and you have used so much of your energy, so much of your breath on worrisome words to the point today that it runs your life. And it's probably why you feel tired all the time. You get an 8-hour night's worth of sleep, and yet you still wake up tired because worry is taking the breath out of you. It's stealing your strength. Don't talk like this. Don't repeat these words. And then Jesus says something really interesting. He says, for the pagans. Now, the Israelites had a lot of national pride, and so for them, a pagan was any basically non-Jew. But when you look at Jesus' words in the light of Scripture as a whole, pagan really just means people who don't believe in him. These non-believers run after all these things, and your Heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. And it's an interesting statement for the pagans. The people who don't believe in me run after these things. But look at the context. He's not talking to the pagans. He's talking to people who saw themselves as children of God. He wasn't talking to the outsiders. He was talking to the insiders, saying, be careful how you live. Be careful what you chase. Be careful of the kinds of priorities you set, because that's what those people do. That's what other people do. And it's not that you're better than them, but if you claim to be children of God, you should find your hope and peace in God. And, I look at the world today, and, there are a group of people within the church who would say all we need is a vaccine. And certainly I don't disagree. I mean, absolutely. Growing up, I had lots of vaccines. I don't even remember what they were all for, but I remember getting needles growing up. And so that's not an abnormal thought. I mean, if you are a Canadian citizen, you have already received vaccines to a certain degree. Measles, mumps, rubella, and other things of that nature. But is that really what our world needs? When you look at the challenges of the heart, soul, and mind, there are some who would say, we just need the right political party to get into power. We just need the right Christian to represent us in culture. And I'm not saying those are all necessarily wrong, but are those the kinds of things that we ought to be chasing? Should we be seeking those things first? Or is there something about Jesus? Is there something about his kingdom that deserves to be a priority in our lives? And if this is true, if we really should and can and do seek his kingdom first, does it lead to a kind of life that is maybe not problematic circumstance-free, but worry-free? If you live this kind of life, is it possible to live what Jesus said? Do not worry about tomorrow. Is it possible to live this way? For tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. And maybe you're watching it and you're doing this, by the way. You take the worries of tomorrow and you layer them onto today. And you take the worries of the day after tomorrow and you layer them onto today. And today you've stacked so many worries onto your life that it's choking the life out of you. You can barely breathe. You're short of breath. You've got this extreme fatigue, even though you get a good night's sleep, because you've just layered worry on top of worry on top of worry, because you're chasing after all these things when Jesus said, no, seek first the kingdom. I am the kingdom. I'm right here in your midst, and I am the God who can do anything. And if we really do serve a God who can do anything, if we really do serve the King of Kings, if we really do serve the King of the universe and beyond, if we serve that kind of a God, if we serve God that can make a way, then do not let worry take your breath away. But there is a reason why worry takes away our breath, why it chokes the life out of us. And it's not an easy reason to hear. Jesus said, seek first the kingdom. And then he warned about chasing the kinds of things that people who don't believe in him chase. And it kind of insinuates that maybe worry is a byproduct of chasing the wrong things. Or to say it a little bit differently, worries are priorities in disguise, because people typically do not worry about that which they do not care about. And what they care about is a reflection of what they think they cannot live without. It's a reflection of what they love. It's a priority, because worries, to some degree, are priorities in disguise. If you didn't care about it, you probably wouldn't worry about it. And that's not necessarily wrong. I think it's okay to have priorities. The question is, do you know what they are? Because while priorities are usually well established, okay, they're usually well established, they are not always recognized. So if I were to ask you to, write down 10 things that you valued, 10 things that you prioritized, would those 10 things reflect your bank statement? Would they reflect your credit card statement or your credit card debt? Or is there harmony between those? And that's not a matter of right. It's not a matter of wrong. It is simply a matter of fact. Your priorities, your values, the things that you love are more than likely well established. The question is whether or not they're recognized. Do you recognize them? Do you know them? Do you acknowledge them? Do you have the courage to acknowledge them? And this is part of the reason why some people, both Christian and non-Christian alike, really struggle with Jesus, because Jesus is interested in addressing the priorities behind the worries. I would even dare say that Jesus is more interested in addressing the priorities behind the worries. He's even more interested in your priorities than the cause of the worry, because he knows worries are just priorities in disguise, because you worry about it because it's important to you. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be important, but this is where the friction occurs. Are my priorities, the things that I worry about, are they aligned with Jesus' priorities? So when you read, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, is there a harmony between my priorities, what my bank statement basically says, and his kingdom? Is there a harmony there? Now, when I first read this as a new Christian, this word here really tripped me up, like righteousness. In fact, before coming to church, I'm not sure I'd actually ever heard this word, righteousness. And as it was explained to me, I came to believe fairly early on that what this passage says, what this verse says, is basically Jesus wants me to live the right kind of life, to have the right kind of thoughts, to avoid bad decisions, to avoid bad thinking. And while that is not necessarily wrong, I realized later as I matured and as I studied that it was an incomplete thought. Jesus is not just interested in your behavior. He's interested in your priorities. He doesn't just want you to have righteous thoughts. He's really interested in you having righteous priorities. He's so interested in righteous priorities behind our behavior that when you read this text, notice who Jesus didn't blame. So when we read, what will we eat? What will we drink? What will we wear? This lack of food, this lack of clothing, and by extension, by the way, a lack of security, a lack of stability, a lack of safety. And, in that context, there was no social net, there was no government assistance or things of that nature. If you didn't have enough, then well, you were hopeless. But in that extreme context, notice who Jesus didn't blame. He didn't blame the government. He didn't blame any particular political party. In that context, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, or the Romans, he didn't blame them. He didn't even blame their neighbors. Instead, he highlighted their priorities. And it makes me wonder today, do we fall into the trap of blame when our priorities don't work out the way we think they ought to work out, instead of just changing our priorities? I mean, do Christians today fall into the trap of blaming people, blaming governments, blaming political parties, blaming neighbors even, blaming other people, when in fact the problem are the priorities that I don't seem to recognize? And I even have found that in charismatic circles or Pentecostal circles, we have a tendency to blame the enemy of our souls. We have a tendency to blame all of our woes on Satan. And look, he is real, and he is certainly up to no good. But I can't help but wonder that when I get to heaven, that I will learn that my misplaced priorities created worries that did more damage to my life than the enemy. I can't help but wonder that when I get to heaven, I will realize that the biggest problem in my life was me and my priorities. See, if worries are priorities in disguise, then obviously our priorities need to change. But maybe kind of peeling back the curtain or the layers, maybe my perspective on my priorities needs to change. And I would say this, that your worry may never disappear until your perspective changes. And this is really hard to hear, because if worries really are a reflection of our priorities, then, why would anyone want to stop living for what they love or like because you love or like those things? And this is where our passage gets a little absurd. I remember when I first read this passage, or I didn't read it, I heard it in a message, about 7 or 8 months after I became a follower of Christ. And I remember being confused. I was confused that nobody else thought that what they heard was absurd. And I just remember looking around going, you're kidding me, right? There is just no way it was a large church. There is no way 1,000 people are believing what they're hearing. There's just no way. And it made me wonder, they must not be paying attention. They just must be brainwashed or something. But I remember reading this being really perplexed. Like, how can this possibly be? And we read it already. See how the flowers of the field grow. Like, this was not the Royal Botanical Gardens. You understand this, right? This would have been overgrown grass in some areas, probably some flowers, some trees, weeds, a lot of weeds. There was no Weed Be Gone or 2,4-D. There was no, some sort of herbicide or pesticide, kind of protecting the flowers. This would have been wild fields. Today, by the way, we have bylaws about animals defecating on grass. Like, you have to pick it up and put it in the appropriate place. There were no such bylaws in this context. So when you think the flowers of the field, don't go thinking that this is the Royal Botanical Gardens with just an army of people tending to the soil and to the grass. This was basically just the flowers of the field. But think about it. Does the flowers of the field, not the Royal Botanical Gardens, the flowers of the field, the weeds of the field, all the animal excrements that have been lying around in the field that fertilize the soil and whatnot, does all of that compare to Solomon's splendor? Solomon, one of the greatest, one of the most influential, one of the most affluent kings to have ever lived in human history. Do the flowers of the field truly compare to all the splendor of one of the most richest, most affluent people to have lived? How can that possibly be true? Doesn't it just seem absurd? I mean, I'll ask you, does a field of weeds contain more splendor than your wardrobe? Are the tulips more beautiful than your tuxedo? Are the weeds of the field more impressive than what sits in your driveway? Like, do you actually think this way? I know I didn't. I just thought it was absurd. And look, this question is not meant to be taken literally, but it's meant to address our perspective. People whose hearts and minds that have been touched by the power and the presence of Jesus Christ think about this question very differently. And then to add insult to absurdity, Jesus said, the pagans run after these things. And think of who he's talking to. You know, there was a lot, you could argue still is, a lot of national pride. You know, we are Israelites, we're God's people. Well, yeah, but the pagans live this way. And the insinuation is, well, you're living this way. And really, there's a question in the statement, isn't there? If you call yourself God's people, do you think differently? But that's the catch. In order to think differently, your mind has to have been changed by the power of God's presence. And so in a lot of ways, worry is the evidence that your perspective in a particular area needs to be changed by God's presence. And when he changes your perspective in that particular area, that thing that you're worried about, it enables you to experience and to exhibit something that our world desperately needs to see. And you're going to hear this word and you're going to go, how is this word connected to worry? Well, I think it's connected in a lot of ways, but we don't realize it because we just don't really think about it deeply enough at times. When you let God change your perspective about that which you are worrying about, he enables you and empowers you to experience and exhibit courage. And in this context, courage is a lot more about perspective than bravado. And by bravado, I mean, not the, parachuting out of an airplane or bungee jumping off a bridge kind of courage. Certainly that does take, a degree of courage, but I mean inner courage. Do you have the courage to display an emotional courage or a psychological courage or a spiritual courage? In fact, I would say that's the kind of courage our world needs to experience right now from us. The world does not need to see Christians exhibiting, bravado kind of courage. In fact, that's probably the last thing our world needs to see. But I really do think that from the church, our world needs to see us exhibit an emotional courage, a psychological courage, and a spiritual courage. And this kind of courage, as I read this passage in Matthew 6, is not the byproduct of the abundance of stuff, the abundance of things to eat and things to wear and things to drink. It's the byproduct of a life that seeks first the kingdom. In fact, this kind of courage is an emotional, psychological, and spiritual courage that comes from a perspective informed by righteous priorities and the faithful God. And I believe with my whole heart that this is what our world needs to see right now. In fact, not just our world, probably your world. Your children do not really need to see you exhibit and experience a bravado kind of courage. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure it must be very inspiring to have your children watch you skydive or bungee jump or things of that nature. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but there's a greater gift you can give them. There's a greater gift you can give to the people in your life that you care about. There's a greater gift that you can give your neighbors, especially during these tumultuous and turbulent times. You can experience and exhibit an emotional and a psychological and a spiritual courage. But this kind of courage is not the abundance of stuff. It's the byproduct of a heart and mind that's been changed by Christ. It's the byproduct that's of a perspective informed by righteous priorities and a faithful God. But this kind of courage is a choice. You get to choose. In fact, to word it a little bit differently, you get to choose where you use your limited breath. And in the course of this message, I've been saying things like, don't let worry take your breath away or choke the life out of you. Well, the old English word for worry actually means to strangle. And obviously over the years, it went on to take more of a figurative meaning. But when I say don't use your limited breath or waste your limited breath on worry, I mean that statement to be both literal and figurative. Do not let worry choke the life out of you. And as hard as it might be to hear, what you let worry do to you is your choice. You can choose. You can use your breath for words that lead to life, or you can use your breath for words that lead to death. The average North American, male and female, speak about 16,000 words a day each. You might be wondering, well, men or women speak more. Actually, statistically, it's about the same, believe it or not. But every one of those 16,000 words is a choice that you made. You can choose to give breath to worrisome words that lead to death, or you can choose to give breath to words that lead to life. The Bible even says that the power of life and death is in the tongue. What you give voice to, what you use your breath for, has the power to create life, or it has the power to create death. And if you use your limited breath on worry, well, can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Can worry actually add? When you give a voice to worrisome words, what will we eat? What will we drink? What will we wear? Are you adding to your life, or are you subtracting? When you give breath to words that lead to death, you are subtracting something from your psychological health. You are subtracting something from your emotional health. You are subtracting something from your spiritual health. You are subtracting something that our world desperately needs to see in you right now in this moment. But as you fix your eyes on him, he has the power to add something to your life. But how? And usually when we read this passage, at least in the messages that I've heard and the books that I've read, we're so quick to jump to verse 33 where it says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. In fact, I think to our detriment, we're so quick to jump to the proverbial punchline, that big thought in the passage, that we neglect the other words of Jesus in this passage that are not just practical, they're practically and powerfully profound. That before you get here, there might be some things that you need to do. In fact, these other things might even be a part of seeking first his kingdom. And we're so quick to jump to this that we neglect just the practical words that he said. And I think these practical words in closing are something that you and I desperately need to apply and do today. And it's really simple. Do not worry saying. Stop talking like this. Stop giving voice to what will we eat? What will we wear? What will we drink? What about my clothes? What about my job? What about my marriage? What about my kids? Yes, you have to deal with challenges, but stop talking like this. Make the decision to use your limited breath on words that lead to life, not words that lead to death. If you want to experience the supernatural courage and the supernatural peace, and maybe even the supernatural provision of God, stop giving breath, stop giving voice to words that lead to death, but start giving breath to words that lead to life. Stop saying these things. And when you read this, you're probably thinking, okay, Pastor, this is great advice, but what if you already did? What do you do if you've already spent years, maybe it's for some of us watching, maybe decades, using your breath on words that have led to death? And as you hear this message today, you might be thinking, Pastor, this is actually really good advice. I really need to hear it. Maybe I'll even share this message with a friend. But what do you do if you've already lived the opposite of what the scripture says? What do you do if you've already used your limited breath on words that lead to death? What do you do if you feel like your mind is already spinning out of control with thoughts that you can't control? In fact, in the Greek, that's what worry just means, is to take that thought. Don't let that thought spiral out of control. But what if you already made that decision to let it spiral out of control? What if you feel like your mind and your thought process is in a whirlwind? What do you do if you've already spent years using breath on words that have led to death? It's like an engine that just revs up. It's easy to say, well, don't let it rev up. But what if it's already been revved? What if these thoughts keep spinning and these worries keep debilitating me? Well, there's something that Jesus said a little bit later on in the Gospel of Matthew. And he said these words a long time ago, but I believe with all my heart that he's saying these words today. And in closing, as we just, bring this message down to a close, what is Jesus saying to you today? And I believe with all my heart that what he said in chapter 11, verse 28 in the Gospel of Matthew is something that you and I desperately need to hear. And especially if you would say, this is me. I spent weeks, months, years, maybe this year of quarantine has been basically a year of just your thoughts spinning and spinning and spinning out of control. And that is not to say that you don't need help or prayer or intervention or medicine or things of that nature. Of course not. But maybe for you, this year has been a year of just crippling worry, crippling panic or whatever. I believe with all my heart that Jesus, though he said these words 2,000 years ago, he's saying these words to you today by the power of his Holy Spirit. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Jesus is still big enough to carry all your cares. You can cast all your cares on him because he cares for you. He can handle it. He can handle your life. He can handle those things that are just spiraling out of control. Because if God really can make a way, you do not need to let worry take your breath away. But as we draw this message to a close, what is one thing you can do? And as I read this passage, I couldn't stop reading those words over and over again. What will we eat? What will we drink? What will we wear? And so as we bring this message to a close, here's the one thing that I think you and I need to do, or at least do a better job of. We need to be mindful of what we repeat. And when you read, what will we eat? What will we drink? What will we wear? It was not meant to be interpreted as a psychology class, but as I read it, I realized something practical. You have to be mindful of what you repeat. You may even need a strategy of intervention when your thoughts get out of control. You need to be mindful of what you repeat. You and I need to start rehearsing words that do not lead to death, but words that lead to life. And even as we close in worship, and as you see words on a screen, as we worship and pray and sing together, it's not just words. Worship is an opportunity to rehearse words of life over our lives. Worship is an opportunity to fix our lives on the one who has the power to do something in your marriage, who has the power to do something in the lives of your children. It's an opportunity to focus on the one who has the power to save this world. So be mindful of what you choose to repeat. In this moment, right here, right now, we have an opportunity to focus on and to rehearse, to repeat, to give voice, to give breath to words that lead to life. And so as we just take a moment and worship, church, breathe. Breathe in as life. Breathe in as hope. Breathe in as peace. Breathe in the kind of rest that dispels worry as we fix our eyes on him.